Welcome everyone to the Center for Applied Linguistics webinar, Meeting the Social Distancing Challenge, Strategies for Adult ESL. This presentation is part of Cal's webinar series, EdPolicy One Takes, and the slides for this webinar and also the recording of this webinar will be available for free on our website, and I am going to send you guys that in the chat box in just one moment. So my name is Chelsea Lafferty. I am the Associate Manager of Adult Language and Literacy Education at Cal. I will be monitoring the questions box throughout the presentation, so feel free to ask questions or make comments by typing them into the question box. We will have time at the very end for our featured presenter to answer any questions. We ask that you reference the slide number that your question might be associated with. We are also live tweeting this on the Cal Twitter page, which is Cal_linguistics. And so you can also share those on Twitter as well. But without further ado, our featured presenter today is Deborah Kennedy. Thank you so much, Deborah, for being with us. Deborah was the Associate Vice President of Adult English Language Education at Cal up until 2016, and has since been the President of the National Coalition for Literacy. So, Deborah, thank you so much for being with us today and for joining us.
Thank you, Chelsea, and hello everyone. It's good to be with you today to talk about social distancing and how we're handling it in the adult education arena, particularly adult ESL. As Chelsea said, I'm the president of the National Coalition for Literacy, or NCL. The NCL is the umbrella advocacy organization for all of the organizations and programs that provide adult education, ABE, ESL, across the country. We are located in Washington, D.C., and we spend a lot of time communicating with people on the Hill about the needs of the adult education community. The Center for Applied Linguistics is a longtime member of the NCL, and we're glad to have them and glad to do this with them today. Chelsea, if I could have the next slide, please. So our agenda for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about teaching and learning at a distance, what's going on, what we are seeing going on from the field, and provide some resources for teachers to use. Then I'll talk about what's happening with assessment and reporting and some guidance that has come out from the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education in the Department of Education. Assessment and reporting have been a major concern in the field in the last few weeks. And then finally, I'll talk about federal funding, what's happening with that, and some related initiatives from the field. So we'll move to the next slide, please. Teaching and learning at a distance, something that many of you probably didn't expect to be doing quite so abruptly and quite so intensively, but that's what many of us are doing at this point. Next slide. So a lot of organizations, programs, and teachers have moved to online teaching and learning, and there are some really major challenges associated with this as a result of COVID-19. The first one, as I'm sure you're aware, is the lack of connectivity for adult learners to engage in remote education. Many adult learners in our rural areas and some in suburban and urban areas as well just do not have access. I think the latest data from the Pew Center is about 27 or 28% of people in the United States as a whole do not have internet access, broadband access. It may be higher than that actually. The second challenge that we're seeing is the need for online learning platforms and other supports and associated professional development for teachers who are having to use those learning platforms for the first time or who have limited experience with using them. And then the third challenge we're seeing is that many programs are having to really redesign what they're doing in terms of their teaching approaches. The way that you teach face-to-face and the way that you teach online are just not the same. And a final challenge to lift up here is state policies on distance learning and equity of access. Every state, or most states, have some kind of a policy on distance learning, and this has made for some real serious challenges in terms of interpreting what can happen and what can't happen with distance learning in adult ed, ABE, ESL programs. States, for example, Pennsylvania, their initial decision was that because distance learning online access was not available to everyone, that adult education could not continue with state level funding online. And I think they've been negotiating about that, but the most recent update that I heard was that they are still having issues with that. Other states, Minnesota, for example, the state policy is clear that distance learning can be a part of adult education, and so they have been implementing a lot of different teaching approaches online. So these challenges mean that teachers and programs themselves have been thrown back on their own resources to figure out what to do. And I'm happy to say that there is incredibly creative work going on all over the country by teachers who have really stepped up to this challenge and are providing online teaching, providing teaching in other ways for their learners, and staying in touch. And one bright spot that has emerged recently is where adult learners do have broadband access. By shifting instruction to online learning, they have overcome the barriers that they have traditionally had to participation, because the transportation issues and the childcare issues that prevent them from participating in adult education are gone. When they can participate from home. So that's a little bright spot that some are experiencing. Unfortunately, it's just a small bright candle in a rather dark overall scenario. Next slide, please. One thing that, or some things that a lot of programs are doing is providing print materials for their learners and getting those out to them, either by delivering them to their houses or making them available at community centers, grocery stores, and other places. These are called alternative assignment packets down in the Carolinas. Maybe your state has some name for them as well. Things that teachers have printed out or programs have printed out to keep their learners working and learning during this time. Another thing, if you're as old as I am, you remember telephone tutoring, or maybe you've still been doing it. Telephone tutoring is making a real comeback because it's one way for teachers to stay in touch with their learners. And particularly if you have small groups of learners, it's feasible to do that. So telephone tutoring is happening. And finally, programs and teachers have been coordinating with businesses and community colleges and other entities that have an online Wi-Fi system to provide hotspots in their parking lots or outside their businesses so that people can come in their cars and get online that way. And that's turning out to be a real asset where programs are able to collaborate with the community colleges and businesses that way. It's building relationships in communities to provide access for adult learners as much as possible. The thing that comes out with all of this, whether online or on paper or on the telephone, is the importance for teachers of staying in touch with your learners. They need to know, just like our K-12 students need to know. Our adult learners need to know that their teachers and their programs are thinking of them, know what's going on with them, and care about them. So we'll move on from that to some resources. Next slide, please, Chelsea. Oh, the teaching survey. Sorry, this just came up yesterday. Stuck this slide in. There's a group of people who are going to be conducting a teaching survey to understand, as it says here, how teachers and program administrators are shifting instruction and programs in response to the pandemic. They're going to do a SurveyMonkey survey fairly broadly, and then individual interviews on that, which will be a little more extensive. And the data that's gathered will be used by all kinds of adult education stakeholders as informative for capacity and needs in the adult education system. The folks who are conducting this are really hopeful that the data will be useful, in particular for advocacy for funding for greater internet access throughout the country. This project's being coordinated by the EdTech Center at World Education in Boston. If you'd like to participate or you're interested in learning more, please contact Jen Vanek, and there is her email address. And if you're willing or interested in participating in the interviews, please contact Carol Clymer. Dr. Clymer teaches at Penn State in the Goodling Institute for Family Literacy, and she will be one of the interviewers. So if you're interested in participating in that survey, it would be very helpful to have your input, and we would appreciate it. Now we'll move to the resources on the next slide. Lots of resources out there, and many of these have contributions from teachers in the field. But I recommend visiting all of these to see what you can find, what might be useful to you about these. Many of them are focused on how to get online and how to teach online, but there are other things as well, particularly in the pro-literacy resources and in resources from World Education, from the New England Literacy Resource Center, that are print materials that can be printed out and distributed to learners as well. For example, pro-literacy, one of the recent issues of News for You, their newspaper for adult learners, is available free to be printed out and distributed to learners. Next slide has some more resources. The OTAN, Outreach and Technical Assistance Network, is a wonderful resource. It has been for years. They provide some really good COVID-19 field support resources there. The list of resources for transitioning to online learning is put together by David Rosen, Dr. David Rosen, who has been involved in online learning and online teaching in this field for many years. Then the National Skills Coalition has a series of podcasts. The one that's referenced here in the URL is the most recent one, which just came out yesterday afternoon or this morning. They talk about what is happening with getting online and ways of using online access with learners. And finally, AIR, the American Institutes for Research, has a technology for teaching and learning resource page. So I commend those different resources to you for your use. Next slide, please. Now we'll talk a little bit about assessment and reporting. As I said at the beginning, assessment has been and reporting have been really nervous-making issues for many in the field. So let's move to our next slide. So the tests that you're probably most likely to be working with if you're teaching adult ESL are CASAS and Best Plus and Best Literacy. The CASAS folks are working on how to make CASAS testing available for remote administration. They aren't ready to release it yet. They have developed their guidelines and they are now working on the process for making it available. And the link that you see here, URL that you see here, is where you can go for updates. They post an update every week or week and a half about how they're coming along with that. I believe that they are working with the state of California as one of their testing sites or development sites. So it may be that the CASAS testing will become available in California before it does in the rest of the country. But they are certainly working on that. And then Best Plus and Best Literacy. Best Plus can be administered virtually. You can get some guidance by contacting them at the address you see there. Best Literacy is a paper and pencil test. You can't administer that one virtually. But if you go to the Cal website there for adult education and assessment, you can find more information. Next slide, please. So Octave, the concern here is how programs will report on student progress and whether there will be a penalty for programs that aren't able to report because they don't have figures or are unable to evaluate carefully what their outcomes are saying for 2019, PY 2019. And so the important thing to realize is that the Octave folks will not evaluate performance, success, or failure for the PY 2019 performance data, which gets submitted by October 1st of 2020. There are no determinations that are going to be made on the basis of your current year performance data. And they will take the effect of the COVID-19 situation into consideration as they look at that data. Now, the important thing to note here, Octave encourages state adult education agencies to monitor the effect on performance and address that. So that's putting the burden on the states and programs to monitor and figure out how to monitor those outcomes and performance. And you can report the time that participants spent on distance learning in the NRS if that's what your state decides to do. If you in your program have questions about what's happening in your state, the person to contact would be your state director of adult education. And if you don't know who your state director is, you can contact the National Association of State Directors of Adult Education, NASDA, and find out. The reference there at the bottom is where you can read that full memo from Octave about the testing and reporting situation. Next slide, please. Octave has also, or the government has also released Memo 20-4, which talks about flexibility in testing procedures and notes in particular that states may revise their assessment policy now. The assessment policy that is in place for 2019 can be revised in the light of the COVID-19 situation. And there's the reference there to read that memo in full. And then the final bullet point there is where to go online to follow up on Octave, other information that they may release. But the important point on this slide is about being able to revise your assessment policy in relation to the current situation. Next slide, please. So the challenge, as I said, Octave encourages state adult education agencies to monitor and to address. But the problem, as you're probably aware if you're reporting through the NRS, is the way the NRS reporting system takes in information. It may not be possible to disaggregate the data in a way that shows what happened since, say, March 1st of this year versus what happened earlier in PY 2019. So states are going to have to figure out for themselves how to track these effects, what factors should be included, and how to make connections between the effects of COVID-19 or the effects of distance learning and what the outcomes are. And when I say we, I mean the NCL and our member organizations are looking at maybe some ways of supporting states in doing that, because it's going to be a tricky business to figure out and to have comparable data across states on that. So just be aware that we are aware of that problem and are thinking about how to manage it. Next slide, please. And so our final topic for today, federal funding and related initiatives. This is the large funding packages that Congress has been supporting that I'll be talking about in this section. Next slide. So the CARES Act, this is the one that was passed on March 27th. And this act includes the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or GEAR, which provides a pot of money specifically for emergency support for education initiatives. And the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, that is Title II of WIOA, is specifically included in the allowable uses for this funding. Each state has a defined amount of money out of that $3 billion for its emergency fund. And the governor is the one who decides on how much of it goes for each initiative. Initiatives that it can cover include professional development and purchase of educational technology. In the reporting that I've heard from states to date, what's happening in most states is the governor isn't making those decisions herself or himself, but rather is putting together a little advisory panel to help guide those decisions. So finding out who's on that advisory panel and being in touch with the governor's office are really key, because there's going to be a lot of competition, obviously, for these funds. The Commission on Adult Basic Education, COABE, has a letter on its Educate and Elevate platform that will allow you to send a message directly to your state's governor. It's a wonderful tool that they have for contacting decision makers directly, and you can go to their website at the URL there and connect to that letter and send it directly to your governor's office to point out the need for emergency funds out of this pot of money for your program or for adult education in your state in general. And I recommend that you do that as quickly as possible, because that money is out there. The governors have it already and they're deciding how to use it. So I think time is of the essence in terms of following up on this one. Next slide, please. In addition to that, there are some private sector advocacy initiatives that are going on. This is because there's hope that there will be another funding bill, not the one that was just passed, which is focused mostly on help for or support for healthcare and for small businesses. But there is work going on in Congress on more funding for education and training and for digital inclusion, the twin problems that we are up against with this COVID-19 situation. The Campaign to Invest in America's Workforce sent in a letter to the leaders of Congress on both sides, Senate and House, that requested $15.1 billion for workforce development overall, the entire workforce development system. And in that, they included specifically $1 billion request for WIOA Title II, the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act activities. That's $1 billion seems like a lot of money to me, but actually from the perspective of what we need for Title II, it probably isn't that much, but it would certainly be helpful. You can read that letter at the URL I've provided there. And the good news is that we have supporters in both the Senate and the House who are circulating what's called a Dear Colleague letter. That's a letter that advocates for a certain level of funding or other issue. These Dear Colleague letters are circulating to support this request of the $15 billion for workforce development, with the $1 billion for AFLA included in it. Also, on the digital inclusion side, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights sent in a letter, same thing, to the congressional leadership, asking for $2 to $3 billion per month for the duration of the COVID-19 emergency, whatever that might be, to support access to broadband for low-income and unemployed persons in the U.S. You can read that letter at the URL there. That letter also received a lot of support from Congress and is moving forward. The activity on digital inclusion is moving forward as well. Next slide, please. So on education and training, the Dear Colleague letters that I mentioned, on the House side, they were sponsored by Representatives Bonamici and Levin, and on the Senate side by Senators Merkley and Blumenthal. So if you live in Oregon or Michigan or Connecticut, you might want to contact your legislator to say thank you. And You also could contact your legislator if you don't live in one of those states to say, did you support this? And I would encourage you to support the ideas contained in this Dear Colleague letter. The next level of initiative is something called the Unite Act. This act is in development now in the offices of Senators Markey and Van Hollen. And this is an act that will fund education more than or above and beyond what's already been funded in the previous acts. It looks like it's going to be rolled into a larger piece of legislation. It is not certain when that will happen or how it will happen, but it is out there, and we have put in a specific request to have it name adult education in the education part of the language, to specifically reference adult education, including literacy, numeracy, and English as a second language in that act. And the senators' offices were very receptive to that, so we're hopeful that that will happen. There will be a parallel act in the House. We don't know anything further about that yet. On the digital inclusion side, the CARES Act, which is already in force, does include $50 million for something called the Digital Equity Act, which has been circulating on the Hill for a year or maybe a little more now. It was started on the Senate side, and then a parallel act included, or bill, put in place in the House. You can go to the website for it, digitalequityact.org, to learn more about it. It's basically an act initially sponsored by Senator Patty Murray from Washington State, focused on making digital equity the case across the country. And now that has just become so much more important under these circumstances. So there are some things that you can do as an advocate if you want to follow up on those. And our next slide, please. Here are some resources that you can look at from the National Skills Coalition to learn more about what's going on with these things. I recommend following the National Skills Coalition. They're really on top of what's happening with all of these things. They do an amazing amount of work on these things. And the second reference there, the State Policy COVID-19 Response Toolkit, is useful also for seeing, they detail some of the things that are going on in states, in specific states, in that report. And it's quite useful to read through that and see what's happening in different states. And I think we have one more.